She was just a homeless girl, with a braid as long as the days she spent invisible, until a lonely millionaire stopped to look and saw more than the world ever had. What started as compassion turned into a love too deep to hide. Get ready. This story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let us know where you're watching from. She was just another shadow in a city that rushed by without ever looking sideways. Julia had no home, but she carried a braid as long as the days she'd gone unseen. Her silence was thick as fog, not the absence of sound, but the weight of questions no one ever dared to ask. She slept in train stations, read street signs like broken promises, and spoke only to her own footsteps. One thing alone kept her standing, the stubborn thread of hope, even when everything else hurt. At the age of 7, she was left in a cardboard box with a note. Take care of her, if you can. But no one could. She grew up among voices that never spoke her name and hands that gave commands, not affection. It was there she learned. The absence of a home wasn't just physical. It was a wound that breathed with her. She never had a mirror, but she knew what others saw. Just another dirty girl with eyes far too alert for someone so small. And yet, something inside her still dreamed of a place called home. When adolescence arrived, the city grew colder. People passed by and veered away from her as if her hair were trash, as if her body wasn't worth care. But Julia discovered something no one could take. Her soul was untouched. With every rejection, a new layer of courage bloomed like a flower in a crack. She was a girl who carried ancient wounds and questions no one dared answer. And on a stormy night, fate finally chose not to ignore her. That night, the sky seemed to forget how to stop crying. Cars gleamed beneath the rain, but inside the city's most expensive restaurant, everything shone, as if the world were flawless. Soft golden lights, polished silverware, and a groom anxiously about to seal a future that was already falling apart. Into this scene walked Julia, soaked to the bone, her feet raw, her heart starving. She didn't want money, just a warm meal and a little dignity. But fate doesn't listen to silent pleas. When she curled up under the table, clutching her coat like a fragile wall against the world, the entire room froze. The groom, bending to retrieve a fallen ring, met her eyes. Wide, frightened, deeply human. No one screamed. No one helped. They just stared, as if they'd seen a ghost. And in that instant, it was as if time itself paused to hear the heartbeat of a soul no one had ever truly known. Across the table, Thomas had no idea that night would mark the beginning of a silent revolution. Wealthy, refined, owner of everything money could buy, except peace. He should have been angry with his fiancée, but his gaze was drawn to the fragile figure beneath the tablecloth. For the first time in years, something inside him cracked, not because of her, but because of himself. In those weary eyes, he saw the same emptiness he'd carried for decades, and that, though no one noticed, was the beginning of a miracle. After the heavy stares faded and the embarrassment was swept away like breadcrumbs from a table, Thomas did something no one expected from a man like him. He walked to the side of the restaurant, where Julia sat on the floor, hugging her knees, curled up like a flower trying to survive winter, and without ceremony asked if she had eaten anything that day. The question was simple, yet it cut through the silence like a warm breeze on a stormy night. She didn't answer right away. Fear was still stronger than hunger. But Thomas didn't push. Instead, he asked the waiter to set up a table outside, on the sidewalk, under the light drizzle that had begun to ease. "If you can't come into the restaurant, then the restaurant will come to you," he said. That broke something inside her. She laughed and then cried, because for the first time in a very long time, someone did something for her, expecting nothing in return. It wasn't pity, it was presence. The two of them sat side by side, like strangers in a world never built for them. They ate slowly, sharing not just the food, but the silence, the curiosity, the little fragments of soul that only come out when no one's in a hurry. And there, On the damp sidewalk, between a sip of juice and a piece of bread, an invisible seed was planted. Something new, something unnamed, but already threatening to grow. And growth, my friend, always comes at a cost. After the dining room emptied and the lights dimmed one by one, Julia found herself sitting on the curb, hugging her knees like she used to on cold nights in shelters. She still couldn't understand how everything had changed so fast. Her heart beat wildly, mixing shame, relief, and a lingering sense of disbelief. Thomas appeared beside her, not rushed, but present. He sat down quietly. That kind of silence that heals more than words ever could. He didn't say she was safe, nor that everything would be okay. He just stayed there, breathing the same air, carrying the same weight. Then he said something unexpected. "I have a spare room in my house. You don't have to thank me. Just say yes." Julia furrowed her brow, suspicious. "Why?" And Thomas, eyes glistening, replied, "Because I know what it's like to be surrounded by people and still feel cold inside." The offer hung in the air like a flower blooming in snow. She hesitated. The offer was simple, but heavy with something deeper: trust. Julia looked at the ring still in her hand and realized that night hadn't just been about a scandal. It had been about being seen, not as a burden, but as someone who carried scars and still deserved a fresh start. "If I enter that house," she said, "it won't be as a guest. It'll be as someone who still believes in miracles." And Thomas, without smiling, simply nodded. Deep down, he wanted to believe too, but he had no idea what was yet to come. The day passed slowly inside the quiet house. Julia didn't touch anything, but she observed everything, like someone trying to understand the world through details. A photo frame caught her attention. A blonde woman, smiling warmly. It was Thomas's mother. On the back of the frame, a handwritten message read, "Never forget where you came from." It stirred something deep within her. For the first time, she sensed that the man behind all that cold elegance carried wounds too, just framed in gold. When Thomas returned in the late afternoon, he didn't expect to find the table set. A glass of water, 2 pieces of bread, and a single flower, plucked from the apartment garden, sat in a makeshift vase. Julia didn't know how to cook or where the silverware was, but she tried. He stood in silence, sat down slowly, and said just one word: "Thank you." It was during that humble, quiet dinner that the walls began to crack. He asked where she was from, and she replied, "From nowhere, but today, maybe from wherever you are." And then he smiled for the first time. Later that night, he in his room, she on the sofa, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence anymore. It felt lighter now, full of possibility. Julia stared at the ceiling, listening to the muffled hum of the city. Thomas, on the other side of the wall, took deep breaths as if trying to remember how it felt to trust. And in that early morning stillness, without either of them realizing it, a flower began to bloom in the quiet garden of a house that had only ever sheltered the past. The next morning, Julia went downstairs to get some fresh air. She wore one of Thomas's oversized shirts, and her hair was pulled into a messy bun. In the lobby, the doorman glanced at her from head to toe, his gaze speaking louder than words. "You're probably not family," he muttered. Julia felt the weight of the world in that one look. She hurried back upstairs, heart pounding, the feeling creeping in that the past was about to knock on her door again, uninvited. That same afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. David, Thomas's best friend and business partner in much of the family empire. A sharp-tongued man, impeccably dressed with a crooked smile. When he walked in and saw Julia on the couch, he raised an eyebrow. "Who's this?" he asked, staring straight at Thomas. Before Thomas could reply, Julia stood up, trying to hide her discomfort. But David didn't hold back. "You can't afford to play charity with someone like that, especially after what Vanessa did. The media's already speculating. Our investors too." Thomas ignored him for a moment, but Julia felt the ground slip from under her feet when David, with a mocking tone, added, "You know she was once caught stealing, right? This could ruin your reputation." The air went still. Julia turned to Thomas in shock, waiting for a word, a defense, anything. But he said nothing, not out of doubt, but out of fear of making it worse. And in that silence, louder than a scream, the fragile bond between them began to splinter. The flower that bloomed yesterday, today trembled in the wind. That night, Julia didn't eat dinner. She didn't go downstairs, didn't turn on the TV. Sitting in the guest room, she stared at her reflection in the old mirror. Her braid fell down her back like a ribbon of untold stories. Long, beautiful, alive, and heavy. She remembered the children at the shelter laughing at her. Remembered when someone once cut a piece of her braid while she slept, just to see if it was real. But now, in that luxurious apartment, it was David's words that echoed loudest. People like her, as if she were a category. She thought about leaving. She even packed the little she had into her faded bag. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Thomas. The door, left ajar, revealed his face, tired, tense, but changed. He didn't speak. He looked at her, then at the braid. "You know," he said, voice nearly breaking, "you look like someone from a fairy tale." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Rapunzel," he added, "only instead of waiting for a prince, you climbed your own tower." But even that attempt at tenderness didn't erase the hurt she carried from his silence in front of David. "You defended me from police, but not from someone who calls you brother," she said coldly. Thomas swallowed hard. "I didn't know what to say." Julia met his eyes. "Sometimes what you don't say weighs more than anything you could." And before gently closing the door, she added, "You still see me as an intruder. The difference is that now the cell has pillows." The silence returned, but this time it burned like a hidden fire. The next afternoon, Julia stood alone on the balcony. The sun lit the golden strands of her braid, and the breeze made it sway as if it were alive. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible there. But the calm was broken by a sharp ring at the doorbell. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with a woman in red, high heels, bold perfume, the kind that lingers in the air like a threat. It was Elisa, Thomas's ex-fiancée. "So you're his new charity case." The words slapped her, disguised as a smile. Julia held her composure, but every word from Elisa was a needle. "Look, I know you're loving this little fairy tale, playing the fallen princess, but this house, this man, this isn't your story. Girls like you come in through the back door and leave the same way. You're just filling space until he remembers where you belong." Julia said nothing, the same silence life had taught her to swallow. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She just closed the door slowly, like sealing a chapter. She returned to the room, grabbed her bag, and with one last look at the living room where she had laughed for the first time in years, she left. That night, when Thomas came home and didn't find her, he found a note on the table instead. "Some flowers weren't meant to live in crystal vases. Thank you for seeing me, even if just for a moment." The house felt bigger and even emptier. When Julia walked away from Thomas's house, all she had was a threadbare bag and a golden braid that brushed her hips, her only armor in a world that had never seen her. She was beautiful, but beauty, for a woman like her, wasn't a shield. It was a target. The moment her shoes hit the sidewalk, she felt it. The stares, the danger. "How much for the night, sweetheart?" A man in a suit smirked from a street corner. She said nothing, but her cheeks burned with shame, and her heart broke in silence. Over the next few days, she did what she could to survive. Washed dishes in a dingy diner, collected cans around the marketplace, sewed small fabric roses for an old woman who sold trinkets in the park, all for a few coins and a warm plate of food. She slept in shelters when there was room, on park benches when there wasn't. Even on her best days, men's eyes followed her like shadows, uninvited, invasive. "If you cut that braid, they'd stop staring," the seamstress warned her one day. But Julia couldn't. That braid was the last piece of the girl who once believed in miracles. One night, After scrubbing dishes till her fingers cracked, she felt someone following her, a group of teenage boys. She darted into a quiet neighborhood church, where a small choir was rehearsing hymns. She slipped into the last pew, head down, trying to disappear, and for the first time in weeks, she cried. Silent, breathless sobs. Between stained glass and wooden beams she felt old, worn out. Though still young, her soul had aged. On that pew alone she prayed, not for riches, not even for love, just peace, just a place to breathe. Back in Thomas's mansion, the silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was haunting. Every room echoed her name, even if no one dared say it aloud. He tried to keep busy, to return to the routines that once made him feel important. But the piano sat untouched. The curtains remained drawn, and the garden, once immaculate, now lay forgotten, buried beneath brittle leaves. Her absence ached like a splinter under the skin, invisible but relentless. Only now was he starting to understand what her presence had meant. Then, on a cold grey morning, the doorbell rang. Thomas opened the door to a face from his past. Esther, the housekeeper who had raised him when his mother couldn't. Her hair was greyer now, her spine more bent, but her eyes, those sharp, no-nonsense eyes, hadn't changed. "I got a letter," she said, walking in like she still owned the place, "from a girl named Julia. Said thank you for a dinner, on the sidewalk." Thomas went pale. Esther didn't wait for an invitation. She never had. "What did you do to that girl, Thomas?" She pulled him by the hand, right into the overgrown garden his mother once loved. There, she knelt, ran her fingers through the dirt and looked up at him. "You let the most beautiful thing I've ever seen get trampled by your fear." He tried to speak, but she cut him off. "This house used to be a home. Now it's a tomb. And silence, my boy. It'll kill faster than any poison." And that's when he fell to his knees. Not because she told him to, but because hearing Julia's name in Esther's voice felt like watching her soul bloom through the rubble. And that day, he knew, he couldn't wait any longer. Julia now rented a small room in a modest boarding house, paying for it with the little she earned scrubbing dishes in a neighborhood restaurant. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Sweat-earned, honest. In the cracked mirror beside her bed, she no longer recognized herself. The girl with dreams in her eyes was gone. What remained was a woman shaped by hardship. But one thing had endured. Her braid, long, golden, heavy. It still drew glances, some admiring, many invasive. That braid didn't comfort her anymore. It reminded her of everything she'd survived and everything she wished she could forget. That night, seated cross-legged on the thin mattress, Julia held a rusted pair of kitchen scissors. Her hands trembled. She ran her fingers down the length of her braid, like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. She thought of all the times people had told her she was only beautiful because of that hair, as if her soul wasn't enough, as if her pain, her strength, her story could all be reduced to strands. She closed her eyes, and then came the sound, sharp, final, the scissors biting through years of silence. The braid fell to the floor like golden leaves dropping from a tree, too tired to hold on to winter. She opened her eyes, still trembling, but there was something new inside her. Freedom. She cried, yes, but not from grief. It was release. The ache of transformation. That pile of hair on the floor wasn't just about appearance. It was a ritual, a goodbye, a silent scream that she was done letting the world define her worth by anything but her soul. She wrapped the braid in a blue scarf and placed it gently inside a shoebox. And in that small, quiet, sacred act, Julia was reborn. But she didn't know that just beyond her window, fate was already stitching the threads of their next encounter. Time passed without warning. Thomas moved through meetings and deadlines like a ghost, doing everything expected of him, but feeling none of it. The mansion echoed with a silence even his old piano couldn't drown out. He tried to go on. He really did. But her face haunted his sleep. Her voice, the way she clenched her fists when she was scared. It was during one of those mornings, ordinary grey, when he opened the front gate and found a small box on the ground. No note, no explanation, just a folded cloth, and inside it the braid, her braid, the one that once shimmered like old gold in the streetlight. He knew instantly it wasn't a plea, it was a farewell. Julia didn't need to say a word. Her silence screamed. The cutting of that braid was more than a change of look. It was identity surrendered, hope laid bare, a final message that said, "I tried. I came as far as I could. Now it's your turn to decide if any of it was worth chasing." Thomas collapsed to his knees in the garden. The cold ground didn't hurt. It felt deserved, and there, among the wet soil and the weight of his own silence, he finally understood. Sometimes love only blooms after something inside you has died. That gesture wasn't asking for answers. It was asking for courage. Esther found him still on his knees, clutching the scarf in his hands. Thomas wept openly, not just for the woman he'd let go, but for the fear that had kept him from holding on, for the braid that now lay in his lap like a relic of everything he had nearly lost forever. Esther didn't say a word. She sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you know where she is?" he asked, his voice breaking. She shook her head. "No, but I know where you need to be when she appears again, at the right place, with your heart open." Thomas closed his eyes and held the braid to his chest. And there, in the garden of a house full of wealth but empty of warmth, something sacred began to take root. 2 months later, the streets looked different. Autumn had painted everything gold, scattering dry leaves across sidewalks and alleys. The wind carried a silence that felt almost like longing. Thomas had returned to his routines, on the outside at least, but inside he was hollow. Until one chilly Saturday morning, Esther returned from the neighborhood market with tears in her eyes. "She's there, Thomas," she said without pause. "She didn't see me, but I saw her. She's selling handmade soaps with a blue scarf tied around her head, and a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes." He left without thinking, walked the streets like a man holding his own heart in his hands. When he saw her from afar, time slowed. Julia stood tall, thinner, with soap-stained hands and dried petals scattered on the table in front of her. The blue scarf held back the short strands of hair that barely brushed her neck, and even without the braid, she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, not the kind of beauty that turns heads, the kind that had survived hunger, silence, and the cruelty of being unseen. And yet she could still smile, but that smile wasn't for him. He approached slowly, like walking on sacred ground. She saw him, froze, no tears, no words, just the silent collision of two worlds that had tried to go on without each other and failed. Thomas stopped in front of her booth. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said, his voice lower than ever. "I came to ask for a second chance. Not to erase the past, but to start again, the right way." Julia looked him in the eyes, really looked. "Why now?" she asked. He breathed in deeply. "Because only now do I know who I am without you." And it was there, between bars of lavender, chamomile soap, and the faint scent of something handmade and holy, that her heart, for the first time since falling, wavered. Julia didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted across the busy market, looking for shelter in baskets of apples and bundles of mint. Inside, her heart beat an unfamiliar rhythm, caught between fear and the fragile desire to believe again. Life had taught her, promises come easy, but staying, that's rare. Still, there was something in Thomas's eyes, something broken, yes, but also humble. For the first time, she didn't see the man in the suit or the millionaire with contracts. She saw the boy, the one who, maybe, just wanted to be loved too. She untied her apron, wiped her hands on an old towel, and took a breath. "If we're going to start again, let's start with the truth," she said. "I've suffered, and it still hurts, but I've learned. I'm not the girl who hid under a table anymore." Thomas nodded. "And I'm no longer the man who was afraid to feel. Neither of them smiled, but there was peace, like fresh soil before the first bloom. No hurry, no guarantees, just the courage to stay. Julia extended her hand, slowly, no promises, and he took it, firmly, as if holding something precious that, if lost again, might never return. The walk to the car was silent, but it wasn't the silence of abandonment anymore. It was the quiet of two souls recognizing each other after the storm. Once inside, she looked out the window for a moment, then turned to him. "I don't want a mansion. I just want a place where my presence doesn't feel like a mistake." Thomas didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached into the glove box and handed her an envelope. Inside was a sketch of a garden, and at its center, a small house with a tiny porch. "We can start here," he said. Julia, unable to hold back the tear, whispered, "Maybe this is my miracle." Time passed without noise, and as with anything that grows slowly, it was in silence that Julia's new life began to bloom. The house from the drawing became real, fresh paint on the walls, clay pots at the front door. There was no luxury, but there was peace. She learned to tend flowers, and he to tend to silence without running from it. They rarely spoke of the past. But sometimes, at night on the porch, Thomas would take out a small box where she kept an old brooch, made from strands of the braid she once cut, and kiss it like sealing a promise. Julia never let her hair grow long again, not out of bitterness, but out of freedom. She'd say she carried flowers inside her now, and that was enough. The neighbors learned her name, and Thomas became known for leaving work early just to help her pick rosemary. Sometimes they laughed for no reason. The kind of laugh only people who've cried a lot understand. There was no wedding, no party, just one quiet day in the kitchen when Thomas asked, "Will you keep choosing me tomorrow?" And she answered, "If you keep seeing me like you did on the first day, then yes, every tomorrow." Years later, a boy with bright eyes ran through the garden, tripping over the roots of freshly watered soil. "Mum! Dad! The flower bloomed!" Julia came out with hands still wet from soap. Thomas followed with dirt on his apron. They looked at each other for a moment and smiled, because in that bloom, in that child's laughter, lived everything life had tried to take from them and failed. And now, standing in the garden that was once born from silence and watered with courage, comes the question, how many times do we have to lose before we understand what truly matters? How many times have you given your best only to be met with silence? How many times have you let go of something precious, not to be loved, but to be free? Maybe what feels like rejection today is really the push your healing needs. And maybe, just maybe, the love you've been waiting for isn't hiding in words, but in the silent, brave gestures you still dare to make. Maybe what feels like the end is really just the soil where your story is meant to bloom. And if silence still scares you, breathe. Sometimes silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's just the sacred space where God plants your next miracle. If this story reminded you of someone, share it with them. If it touched your heart, leave a comment. Tell me, what moment moved you the most? And if you believe, like I do, that love can melt even the coldest hearts, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and stay with us. Because here, every story has roots, and yours might be the next one to bloom.